Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Let me know how I sound. How are you doing on this Saturday evening? Just a quick sound check. I know YouTube might not be there yet. All right, here we go. YouTube is there. All right. So, good evening, everyone. Good evening. Quick sound check. Let me know if I sound loud, too quiet. Let me know. Just a quick sound check while you're coming in. Make sure you like the video. Make sure you're liking the video. That's how you boost the video in the algorithm. That's how you get more people both live and also watching the video later. Make sure you are dropping a like. Of course, after the video, great to drop a comment as well. But if you are not subscribed to this channel yet, if you are new here, please do subscribe to the channel. That's also a great way to follow this work. And of course, hit the notifications bell because you're not always going to be notified. You may not be notified with the notifications bell either, but you do want to hit it anyway. Also, of course, I'm going through some major changes. We'll be moving across the way due to a lot of issues, one of which being construction. So move coming up, and I've got a lot of things in store in order to update this channel. So the best way to support this work, if you do appreciate what I do and are able, is to become a member at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You not only support this channel, but you support all the work that I do, from my call-in podcast to my weekly articles, or well, now it's a little less than weekly, semi-weekly, but regular articles as well. So that's the best way to support me is on Patreon. And then, of course, there are many other options in the description of this video. So good evening, everyone. Good evening. All right. It's good to be with you on this Saturday evening. My wife is working overnight tonight. We're here watching the dog. So I thought I would come on and cover a major stories that I haven't been able to get to for many different reasons. But let me just go through the chat really quick. I'm just going to say hello to folks. All right. All right. So hello, Holly. Hello, Carlos. I'm starting from the middle point about. Hello, KM4OOS. See, we got a troll in the chat. That's all right. Hello, where? Hello, Big Teal. Hi to all the moderators as well. Thank you for moderating this chat. Hello, Nawadi. Hi, Fetish Magic. Thanks so much for the sound check. Said there's a video audio delay. Says 22 many. Hello. I hope that doesn't continue. Let me know. I'm plugged into Ethernet, so I hope that doesn't continue. Let me know, everyone. Hello, Seth. How are you? Hi, Vermont. So there's a delay in the sound, huh? That's really unfortunate. Well, I hope that corrects itself because I am plugged in. There's nothing else I can really do about this. Thank you, Vermont, for the information. Hello. Hi, Seb's Dev. I think I know what you're talking about, the Jackson, Mississippi tweet. Yeah, I know. Sometimes you got to do it, though, to get the message across, right? Good to see you. Yeah, let's see. Anyone else? Hello, Elu. Hello, if that's how you say it. Hi, 31st Century Socialism. Welcome back. Hello, Loa. Good to see you. Hi, Joe Cool. Z as well. Christian Gomez says, trolls means you're being effective. Well, I hope so. So thanks. So someone says maybe a refresh. Well, if I refresh, I go away. So hopefully that straightens out, because if I refresh, I do go away and then I would come back. I don't want to do that because I know that can mess up people and don't want to. Yeah, that sucks. There's a bit of desync, huh? That's what people are saying. Well, let's hope that changes, okay? Hi, Ping. Thank you for the thank you for the compliment. All right, everyone. So what I'm going to do, okay, to begin this, a friend of the show, Fiorella Isabella, she she works at RT now. She's a Convo Couch host, and she, I think, can help start us off here. She came out with a segment on RT explaining the energy crisis, in particular, a new policy that the G7, led by the United States, is hoping to employ, a price cap on Russian energy. And now, just for some context, there's an energy crisis afoot in Europe. That's what we were going to be talking about, because there are protests that have been happening over the past week and a half or so in response to this. And so, man, people are saying the delay is bad. Okay, well, so there's an energy crisis, right? There's sanctions on Russia. Russia is now the most sanctioned country in the world, and that happened directly after the Russia military operation in Ukraine began in late February. Right after that, the United States, Europe, the EU went absolutely ballistic with sanctions. And now the impact has been quite clear. These sanctions have caused economic catastrophe, and now there are protests going on. And there's no real evidence that shows that the U.S. and Europe get the situation. They are continuing to push forward with really draconian, very counterproductive sanctions, and now they're trying to push a price cap on the entire world energy market on Russian energy. They're trying to say that you can only purchase Russian energy, trade Russian energy at a certain price, at a low price, in order to cripple Russia. And Fiorella Isabella has a really good segment that I want to show you to get this point across, right? She does a really good job, I think, of going over the situation overall and the context for this price cap. All right, so I'm going to share with you this video because I definitely want you to see exactly and get a little bit of a review before I get into the consequences, before I get into the protests, before I get into what Europeans themselves are saying that they are suffering. And we know in the United States, I'm in the United States, we know that this energy crisis has hit here too. There is still rampant inflation. The cost, my rent is going to go up $400 next month, right? It's absolutely asinine. And this is the crisis that has been spurred in part and in large part due to this reckless foreign policy of the United States and its European junior partners that are literally going along like dogs on a leash. So here we go. All right. So we're going to listen. Let me know if you can hear it, okay?
Price cap by December 5th, which is the date that the European six package goes into effect, and it will be put in place by the United States, but also by our G7 allies.
But according to some critics, the West is putting the cart before the horse. And the reality is the chances of a G7 price cap on Russian oil actually being effective are slim to none, and best summed up by a tweet.
My friends and I have agreed to impose a price cap on our local pub's beer. Mind, we actually do not plan to drink any beer there. The pub's owner says he won't sell beer to anyone observing the cap, so other patrons who drink a lot there say they aren't joining the cap. Success.
Russia has explicitly stated not once, but twice, just in the past week, that it will not sell oil to countries which support such a price cap.
We will not supply anything at all if it is contrary to our interests, in this case, economic interests. No gas, no oil, no coal, no fuel, nothing.
And contrary to what some in the West may believe, Russia seems to have a choice, because for price caps to actually work, the G7 would need significant global support, especially given that over 2/3 of the world's countries have refused to condemn Russia's military operation in Ukraine or impose any sanctions on Moscow. And despite the U.S. optimism on getting China and India on board, they remain two of Russia's biggest clients, while China and Indonesia have already vetoed the idea. In February, the West swiftly shifted its focus from 10 years of sanctioning Iran to Russia, targeting it with so many sanctions that it became the most sanctioned country in just 10 days. According to the US, these sanctions would undoubtedly bring the Russian economy to its knees. At least that's what Joe Biden thought would happen back in March.
As a result of these unprecedented sanctions, the ruble almost is immediately reduced to rubble.
Well, not quite, because the ruble went on to become the world's top performing currency this year, flying in the face of the supposedly crippling sanctions. And while Russian food prices have recently gone down, the fallout from the sanctions has hurt the West and developing nations, with a significant increase in food prices there. And let's not forget that, as Vladimir Putin also predicted, energy costs are skyrocketing, creating devastating conditions and hurting much of the world's consumers.
Sanctions on Russia cause much more damage to those countries that impose them. The further use of sanctions may lead to even more severe and, without exaggeration, even catastrophic consequences to the global energy markets.
With the cost of fuel and energy in Europe now so high due to sanctions and a green agenda, many people are forced to stock up on firewood. According to Bloomberg, a survey shows that 6 in 10 UK manufacturers are in danger of going out of business because they cannot afford the soaring energy bills. Even mainstream media outlets have begun admitting their surprise that the Russian economy has held up, with British tabloid The Sun showing that food prices in Russia are lower than those in the UK, while the energy costs in Britain have increased by 80%. The situation is already boiling over in some countries as mass protests against NATO have erupted in Europe, with citizens blaming their government's actions for the economic fallout. In the Czech Republic, 70,000 demonstrators gathered in Prague to protest soaring energy costs and to demand an end to sanctions against Russia.
This is not a free lunch. Sanctions will backlash. Sanctions have a cost.
The price of these sanctions is not just imposed upon Russia. It's imposed upon an awful lot of countries as well, including European countries and our country as well.
The sanctions are indeed directed against 500 million citizens of the EU and against millions of citizens of the rest of Europe.
So will the West ever learn from its own past actions and from leaders like Vladimir Putin blatantly telling them that Russia's warnings are not to be taken lightly? Or will they be yet another example of the definition of insanity and continue doing the same thing over and over while expecting different results?
All right. Well, that was really good work. So kudos to Fiorella for a really great segment. I mean, I don't think I could have summarized the energy crisis better myself. Reminds me, I got to get her on this program as well, because she's been talking about a lot of things with regard to politics, ideology in the US, the left, that I think would be really interesting. But this energy crisis issue, she lays it out perfectly. She talks about the sanctions, the blowback to them, what has happened to Europe. I mean, that statistic of 6 of 10 UK businesses potentially going under, I mean, that is the definition of a mega economic crisis. And this is something that is rocking Europe right now. And the consequences are already being felt, as she said. And all of this is also to say that Russia is not feeling the consequences because of the ways in which Russia has certain advantages, especially having what is a very cheap monopoly on this kind of energy trade. I mean, Russia is right there. Europe had a really good thing going on where they could cultivate a relationship with Russia over energy for extremely low prices, and that is entirely gone. The price of energy is skyrocketed, and Russia is actually reaping benefits from that. So, you know, this anti-Russia agenda, this new Cold War, is really backfiring in this way. And so I want to show you now some of the latest developments, because there are first, I think what's really important, and I'll share this article from The Guardian, to begin September, right? I think it was on the 5th of September, Russia said that they are not going to resume gas supplies to Europe until sanctions are lifted, and they have essentially shut off. They say it's for both for repairs as well as for the reason that all of this talk about price caps, all of this talk about crippling Russia's economy, Vladimir Putin and the Russian government have said, no, we are not going to allow that to happen without responding. And so Nord Stream 1, a huge pipeline that is very important for Russian energy to get to Europe and extremely important for Europe, for all of Europe, Eastern and Western, that is now shut off. And they're not going to do it until sanctions are lifted. Okay, so Dmitry Peskov said that, quote, sanctions introduced against our country by Western countries, including Germany and the UK, are to blame for Russia's failure to deliver gas through the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. Other reasons that would cause problems with the pumping don't exist, Peskov was cited by the Interfax news agency as saying. So Peskov added that Russia's full resumption of gas supplies via Nord Stream 1 was, quote unquote, undoubtedly dependent on whether the West would lift its sanctions on Moscow. Quote, it is these sanctions imposed by the Western states that have brought the situation to what we see now, end quote. So that's what's happening. Russia is saying we are not going to be pushed around. We're not going to be bullied. We're not going to be engaged in a proxy war and be expected to give concessions to imperialist states, the West and the U.S. leading them like poodles into some kind of arrangement that's not going to benefit them, right? Russia literally has, as Fiorella said, thousands of sanctions upon it. Why should Russia accommodate the West at this time? There's absolutely no reason. The West does not want to talk. They don't want to negotiate. They don't want to do diplomacy. More on that in a bit. But I want to now show you what's been happening in response to this, because as we noted, there have been huge consequences, skyrocketing prices, the business, huge losses for business. There was a tweet. I don't know if you saw it. I think it was in Ireland. There was a business owner who showed his bill. He had a Ukraine flag on his Twitter profile. Yeah, he showed his business bill, and his energy, I think his energy bill was over 10,000 euro for a month. I mean, that is absolutely just mind-boggling. But that is the crisis that Europe is facing, and they're doing it at the behest of the United States. And so what has been the result of this? Well, people are angry, rightfully so. Why wouldn't people be angry? Their livelihoods are in danger. Europe, living standards were already declining, just like the United States, already declining. COVID hit Europe really hard. The economic crisis hit Europe really hard. And of course, we know there's just been stagflation, neoliberalism that has really caused a steep decline in the standard of living. But this energy crisis is like fuel to a fire that already was ostensibly uncontrollable. And now there are protests happening. So these protests are happening in many different places, okay? So the first that was reported on was a massive rally in Prague, okay? So in Prague, here's Al Mayadeen. It was reported mainly in international media, so Al Mayadeen here. There was also CGTN, Global Times, RT. These were the outlets that were really reporting on this rally. There were some mainstream reports, but very few, and you wouldn't necessarily find them in the Google algorithm, let's just say. But there were tens of thousands, right? Some say 100,000, some say 70,000. But these protesters were demanding the resignation of Prime Minister Petr Fiala's coalition government over reckless pro-Western and pro-NATO policies. And this article is saying there were 70,000 people nearly gathered in Prague's iconic Wenceslas Square on Saturday to demand change in several areas of government policy. Protesters demanded the resignation of center-right government of Prime Minister Petr Fiala's coalition due to it neglecting its citizens at the expense of war-ravaged Ukraine. Clear outrage was expressed over the growing inflation, soaring energy prices, and then there was also COVID-19 vaccination immigrant. There was a lot of grievances here, but the inflation, the energy prices were a big one. Then you have COVID-19 and immigrants, which unfortunately has swept across Europe, this anti-immigrant sentiment as a way to place blame on the economic crisis. But the one thing about this anti-immigrant sentiment is that's actually fueled by a reckless policy of being the kind of landing spot for the displaced people in countries destroyed by imperialism, especially in Africa, in the Middle East, Syria, for example. And that has placed a lot of downward pressure on the economy because the capitalists have no intention on creating a situation where everyone can live well, which includes peace in the places where, peace and withdrawal, Yankee get out, right? Yankee get out, Euro get out of the countries being terrorized by imperialism, as well as providing a decent standard of living for all people, for all working people. That's really the solution. But of course, workers have been pit against each other. But nonetheless, a lot of anger over the energy crisis. So, the goals of the protests to call for change. We want the issue of energy prices, especially electricity and gas, to be resolved, because if it is not resolved, it will destroy our economy this fall. So there's a lot of worry about this, and there should be a lot of worry about this. Even if there's not a strong left, there should be a lot of worry about this. So that was in Prague. Now, there's more, okay? There are more protests that have occurred. There were definitely some in Germany, and I'm going to get to that. Germany and Italy, says France 24. September 6th, European cost of living crisis leads to protests in Germany and Italy. So pressure is piling on European governments as energy prices continue to soar. After Russia said it wouldn't deliver gas on its Nord Stream 1 pipeline until Western sanctions are lifted, Portugal announced a new support program for households. Austria's chancellor presented a price cap on electricity. Pressure is coming from the streets, with protests rising against rising prices in Germany and Italy. So, all right, that's a video. So we're not going to watch the video. But so these protests are happening, though. These protests are happening. We're not going to watch that whole video because there's a lot to get to. Okay. And it's not a lot. Like, this is not just like, some far right conspiracy, right? People are really struggling right now all across the West, the United States, and the world, because a lot of the world, unfortunately, is dependent upon the economic well-being and stability of the U.S. and the West. That is an unfortunate fact due to the fact that when there's a crisis in Western imperialism, U.S.-led imperialism, that crisis hits harder in the neo-colonial states, which it dominates. So this is hitting everybody. And this includes countries in Europe, and I'm going to show you why. Countries in Europe are struggling. People are struggling, and especially, you'll see a survey here. This is from RT. EU country citizens saving on food to pay for energy. 7 out of 10 Greeks are being forced to buy less food due to rising energy costs. And you know that over the past decade, austerity has absolutely decimated Greece. The economy is in shambles. You had the Syriza movement, which unfortunately sold out. It's social democratic movement that has not lived up to its promises to battle austerity, and austerity has only intensified. Greece's role in NATO and in the European and U.S. military alliance has only increased. But now, with this crisis being so dependent upon this system, has had consequences. Okay, and so here, a growing number of Greeks are cutting back on food to pay their taxes and energy bills. A survey by the General Confederation of Greek Workers and the Labor Institute has shown. When asked if rising prices had forced them to spend less on basic food items, 20% of respondents answered much less, and 51% answered less. So it's 71%. While only a quarter reported little change in their spending habits, only 4% said the situation had not changed for them at all. A majority noted that the change in their spending habits had come from the necessity to pay more for energy. Nearly half respondents, 47%, said they expect a difficult winter as energy prices continue to rise, while 1 in 5 said they may not be able to pay for energy bills in the coming months at all. The Greek economy and society, after years of austerity, are facing a new wave of price increases and reevaluation of basic goods, and stagnant incomes threaten purchasing power of many households and social groups. They suggest that the cost of living crisis in the country could be solved only through government intervention, for instance, by hiking the minimum wage, reducing excise taxes on energy, and imposing a tax on energy companies' excess profits. So there you go. And they're talking about now, so in this article, so Greece is doing this. All European countries are going to do this. they're going to try to institute stopgap measures, a lot of it surrounding rationing. So there's going to be a lot of rationing in Europe based on this crisis. And that is a disaster, because if there's one thing that Europeans, the West, the US is not used to, it's rationing. It's cutting down. There's so much capitalist waste that goes on. Our daily lives, even if we, the working class, live mainly in scarcity, the whole system revolves around overabundance, right? Overproduction and a lot of waste. And so this scarcity, right, the mentality and also the economic effects of it are sending, I think, a shockwave throughout the entire populace outside of the 1%. And it's going to create a lot of instability. And there's going to be a lot of political volatility. And that includes both on the left and on the right. Europe had already been experiencing this, where just like in the United States, there are poles that are growing stronger. The left, which I don't think is strong enough, right? The actual left, the independent left, the working class oriented left, and then the far right, which has gained in a lot of key areas. I mean, Eastern Europe is flooded with the far right, but then you can even think in Western European countries, what's happened in the UK, what's happened in France, what's happened in in Germany even, right? There is this far right kind of sentiment that is having an effect on politics as well. So Europe is likely to freeze. These protests are serious. And I did not show you also France, okay? I said Germany and Italy, but I also have Tim Anderson, someone who I follow for a while, who did really great work on Syria. Now he's I feel really broadened out his analysis. So on September 5th, he said, "Get out NATO." There was a massive rally against NATO, the EU, soaring prices in Paris, France, and he showed this picture. So, here's the video. So there you go. I mean, this isn't proof that the protests are rocking Europe right now, and that's just the beginning, right? Because this is still the fall. This is all about what is going to happen, right? And what already is happening is hitting people to the point where they feel compelled to protest. So, that's the deal. That's the deal with this, okay? And we just have to understand that this isn't going to go well for the US and Europe. And before I get to just a brief update on the Ukraine conflict, okay, I want to actually reload. I want to see if this can resolve itself, because there's a lot of lag, I'm being told. So everybody, stick around. I don't want this whole stream to be lagging. So everybody, stick around. Do not go anywhere. I'm just going to reload this really quick, and I will be back with you very, 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 very soon to get to the next topic. Okay, hold on one second. Okay, am I back? How is it now? That was, I hope, okay. I hope that the lag is better now. So just give me a quick in the chat. Are things better? Ay, ay, ay. So that whole segment, whatever. Because I think I need to clip up that segment to post on the channel. All right. So that was just a brief interruption, everyone. So we got still about an hour left in this program, and we're going to move on now. So let's do this. Keep liking the video. Keep liking the video. Hit that notifications bell, subscription, all that good stuff. And just remember that you are supporting this work. You are making it happen. And the best way to support this is on Patreon, patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. Got a crazy month ahead of me. Moving again, 8th time in 10 years or something like that. 9th time, maybe more than that if I count some smaller things. So, yeah. Please do like the video. And of course, the best way to support is on Patreon because that's how you keep this work going amid all of the crisis. And I know you all are feeling the crisis as well. All right, everyone. Next thing I want to just say is an update because a lot of people have been asking me, Danny, what about Ukraine today? Look at how Ukraine is absolutely going on the offensive against Russia and Kharkov. They are winning again. They are winning now. Things are changing. Well, first, I would say I follow people who do this a little bit better than me in terms of military strategy. People who are really focusing on it. The Duran. You also have Brian Berletic, friend of the show. Watch Brian Berletic's latest video on this. I think he can convince you otherwise. Right, because there's a history in this special military operation of Ukraine going on the offensive and then actually leaving itself out in the open for a counteroffensive. And given this is just the facts, this is what I've known since the beginning, but this is what has transpired throughout this conflict, is that Russia actually has extreme advantages logistically, strategically. It has more, it has better and stronger weapons. Its weapons are actually being used and not being sold on the black market. And every time Ukraine has gone on the offensive, Russia's counteroffensive has been effective. And also, just note that Russia has specific goals and has a specific orientation to this operation, which is not a full-scale war. So Russia is not putting all of its troops out. It's not a mass troop mobilization. It also isn't a full-scale invasion where not only the East is being a theater of battle, but the entire country of Ukraine, right, which could very well be the case if Russia pursued outright war. But even still, right, Russia is relying upon its allies, those it has come to the aid of, the people of Donbass, those militia groups, those organizations that are fighting, right, that are fighting the Ukrainian armed forces and have been since 2014 because they've been under siege. And even today, you saw reports coming out of Donetsk of the Ukrainian army shelling, and I had a lot of trolls coming at me for saying this, but they're shelling hospitals and airports. And of course, what's happening is it's all being blamed on Russia, but there's credible evidence, as there always has been, that the Ukrainian armed forces, the Ukrainian military, has been targeting these civilian institutions for 8 years, terrorizing the Donbass and essentially committing war crimes. And so there's so many people who have apologized for that, who have apologized for these war crimes, absolutely in such a disgusting manner. But we have to talk about it like this. And so I'm not a military strategist, but it's quite clear that Russia has made immense long-term gains and that Ukraine is in a quagmire. And now the entirety of Europe, as well as Ukraine, is in a crisis economically, politically. There's a lot of issues afoot for the bloc of countries that are waging a proxy war on Russia. There has been immense blowback, and that is going to continue to influence what is happening on the ground in Ukraine. It can't not but help do that. It can't not do that, right? It has to do that. That's what's been happening since the beginning. And so now you see, right? You saw Anthony Blinken make a surprise visit in Kiev and then announce another $3 billion in military aid. Well, that military aid, actually, every time the U.S. institutes new military aid, it doesn't do enough because Russia is engaged in a very strategic operation that uses specific kinds of resources and has the support of the people of Donbass by its side, while the Ukrainian armed forces are struggling with that same kind of support, right? You remember in the beginning, oh, look at all these Ukrainian soldiers. Well, a lot of these Ukrainian military personnel are like gangs and far-right groups and people who have committed heinous crimes in Ukraine. There's been such a level of disorganization and an attempt, right, to use foreign mercenaries and all of this that shows that Ukraine is acting as a puppet and that it doesn't have the legitimacy that people in the West may think it does, right? And so Russia is in a good position, regardless of temporary setbacks, regardless of a temporary offensive from Ukraine. Every time that has happened, right, like in Kherson, right, the offensive, the counteroffensive by Russia has been effective. But there's also something that's very interesting about those who want to talk about Ukraine, about like, oh, they're gonna win, they're gonna win, they're gonna win. Oh, Ukraine is, Ukraine is a democracy. We support them. Well, no one is talking about these same, Ukraine flag Twitter, neocons, neoliberals, the entire political class. You have this consensus, this like anti-Russia, new Cold War consensus, but they don't talk about one very important thing that I want to show you. This was revealed recently within the last month, but this is news from April that was just kept secret from us. So what happened? Well, the UK, at the behest of the West, what did it do? Well, the UK, and I'm just trying to find the source right now. Where is it? The UK, at the behest of the United States, did this. They intervened on a peace deal and said, Ukraine, no, you cannot engage in a peace agreement with Russia at this time. So the report is, this is from Robert Scheer's blog, but it went around in the media to a degree. Ukraine tentatively agreed on a peace deal in April. This is from antiwar.com, Dave DeCamp. But it's based on a foreign affairs article. So this was reported on about a week ago, that Russian Ukrainian officials tentatively agreed on a potential peace deal during negotiations in April 2022, according to a foreign affairs article by Fiona Hill and Angela Stent that cited former U.S. officials. The article reads, quote, according to multiple senior U.S. officials we spoke with in April 2022, Russian and Ukrainian negotiators appear to have tentatively agreed on the outlines of a negotiated settlement. The terms of that settlement would have been for Russia to withdraw to the positions it held before launching the invasion on February 24th. In exchange, Ukraine would promise not to seek NATO membership and instead receive security guarantees from a number of countries. The tentative deal was the result of in-person talks between Russian and Ukrainian officials held in Istanbul at the end of March. Virtual talks resumed after the meeting in Istanbul, but the sides ultimately failed to reach a deal. A major factor in the failed negotiated settlement was pressure from the West, according to Ukrainska Pravda. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson urged Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to stop negotiating with Russia when he visited Kiev on April 9th. According to the report, Johnson told Zelensky that even if Ukraine is ready to sign some agreements on guarantees with Putin's, Kiev's Western backers are not. The report said that Russia was ready for a meeting between Putin and Zelensky on a potential peace deal, but it became less likely after Johnson's visit. So here you have the UK with the Queen dying and Liz Truss now the Prime Minister and all sorts of, you had Boris Johnson, right? Not too long after this, he had to resign, but you have him at the behest. This is at the behest of the entire West, right? This is at the behest of the entire West. The entire West, the United States was not ready for a peace deal to take place, so they nixed it. They used their influence. This is how you know Zelensky is a puppet. You know Zelensky is a puppet because he did exactly what his handlers and backers said. He didn't say no. He's not a huge, courageous leader. He's not someone that is waging a democratic crusade against Russian aggression. He is a puppet of U.S. and Western imperialism. And here you see back in April of 2022, how many Ukrainians, how many people in Ukraine, how many military personnel, how many people overall, Russians, how many people could have been spared people of the Donbass, how many people could have been spared? We're talking about thousands upon thousands of people could have been spared if this were to have happened. This was only a month and a half, 2 months tops. A month and a half, 2 months tops of the military operation, and the UK wouldn't let it happen. So I remember those talks. I remember reporting on it. I remember saying they didn't go anywhere. But of course, a lot of things happen in secret that we don't know about. That's the truth. This is not a conspiracy, right? This is part of the way that diplomacy works under imperialism. There is no diplomacy. There is no democracy. There's a lot of elite influence and pressure and dictatorship. This is a dictatorship of capital. And capital, what capital wants with Ukraine? Well, it wants the military industrial complex to get that 60, 70%, however much it is, of those government subsidies, aka military aid to Ukraine. All it is government subsidies to military contractors. So they still want that. They also want, and I think this is the United States, Boris Johnson also acting as a junior partner to the US, a puppet, so to speak. They also want this energy crisis, so to speak. It's not that they want the collateral damage to it, because that's inconvenient and that is causing a crisis. But the United States definitely wants Europe to be weakened. It definitely wants Europe to be a vassal of the United States in its entirety. Not just, okay, we'll go along with you, we'll help you wage wars with NATO, we'll do the austerity through the EU like you do in the US, but we're going to do it at our pace. No, they want Europe. The US elite wants Europe to be full-fledged, completely dominated by the United States, meaning cut off ties with Russia, cut off ties with China, and burn or freeze, I should say. It really is freeze for Europe at this point, because the winter is coming and it's about to get cold. And Boris Johnson and the West and the United States has decided that it is going to sabotage any hope for peace. Any hope for peace will be sabotaged by Boris Johnson, by the West, when it comes to Ukraine. So, I mean, there you have it. What else is there to say about such an egregious crime? I mean, these are war crimes, right, that are being committed. And, everyone wants to talk about Russia. Is Russia committing war crimes? Is Russia doing this and that? It seems that the conflict has been very much contained between Ukrainian armed forces and Russia. And there's a lot of misinformation out there. But what we do know is that a lot of people are getting hurt. A lot of people are being killed, not because Russia is not willing to engage in a peace agreement. This source literally says it. Russia was ready to strike a peace deal with Ukraine in April, and the West and the US said no. This is not dissimilar to the fact that in December of 2021, before the special military operation, what did Vladimir Putin do? What did the Russian government do? It said NATO, the United States, separately but together, let's talk about what our concerns are about how Ukraine is being treated as a de facto NATO state and all that has transpired up until the since the coup in Ukraine in 2014, which led to intense aggression right up along Russia's border, because that's what Donbass is. It's a territory of Ukraine right along Russia's border. And there were intelligence rumblings about, and we won't, I don't think, ever know if this was going to happen, but there were suspicions that Ukraine was going to wage kind of a final strike assault on the Donbass, which would then also possibly lead to Crimea being in danger. Russia has military assets in Crimea now that it's part of the Russian Federation. That was not going to fly. So Russia intervened. That is the kind of untold story here. Oftentimes is that Vladimir Putin was not saying, yeah, I'm going to wage war on Ukraine right now. He literally talked to Joe Biden. He had engagement with NATO in mind. He had that the Russian government had security interests that it outlined quite clearly. In that peace deal that Boris Johnson helped nix, literally outlined it very perfectly. That Ukraine would not become a member of NATO was the biggest one. And demilitarization was another big one. Not just, okay, you're not going to be in NATO, but you're also not going to act like a de facto NATO state. But the United States, Europe, NATO said, nope, we're not going to engage in any talks with you, Putin. You're the aggressor. You're our enemy. Lloyd Austin said, we want to weaken the Russian Federation. Joe Biden said, Vladimir Putin can't remain in power. So let's use Ukraine to try to hasten a regime change scenario in Russia, as they had been working on for a decade, right? Since 2012, there's been this mindset of, well, Vladimir Putin is not the friend that we would want him to be. He's not subservient. Russia's government is not subservient enough, despite the fact that it kept saying, hey, we're going to work with you. We want to help you militarily. We want to have an economic relationship, especially. But because Russia was asserting some sovereignty, now it's time to escalate. Now it's time to intensify this regime change scenario, which is always something that was not going to work. And it's not working now. Russia is stronger than it's been politically. The legitimacy of its government, most people in Russia, most people in the world, you heard Fiorella, 66% of the world, 2/3, don't condemn this. So Russia is not losing here. Russia has a big friend in China. Russia has many friends across the world. And Russia's position as an energy power makes it critical to the world economy, makes it really critical. So Russia's not going to lose here. If it were going to lose, the outcome that we've seen so far would be a lot different, right? This is more than 6 months. We're entering month 7 of this. And while the West and the U.S. are not having any interest or showing no interest in winding this down, we are seeing this quagmire having more negative effects for the West and the United States, the so-called crusaders against Russian aggression. The negative effects are compounding on themselves, and Russia is largely stable and also achieving its objectives and also helping to lead a multipolar world despite this incredibly delicate and unfortunate situation that it is engaged in with Ukraine. So that's the coverage on Ukraine, all right? I want to move on now. Keep liking the video. Keep hitting that subscription button. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel. Hit that notifications bell. And do support me on Patreon. It's the best way to support this work. Patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. It really does help sustain this work. And it also helps alleviate the costs associated with the economic crisis, as well as keeping up this channel, making updates. And those are actually coming very soon. So I want to talk about Syria. Okay. I want to talk about Syria. Syria, right, is not talked about so much anymore, but it's still a very important war. The U.S. is at war with Syria. So the U.S. and the West, the U.S., the NATO countries, luckily, there's been a lot of progress between Turkey and Syria in easing some of that tension, hostilities, because Turkey is part of the occupation force in the northeast, the resource-rich region that the U.S. is occupying. So this war on Syria continues, and it's only become more brutal. All right. So I want to show you what's happening now. So early this month, Syria, right, just for some context, early this month, this was reported. And this should be very troubling to because this war should have ended in 2016. Russia intervened in 2015 on behalf of the Syrian government through the request of them to clear out the proxy groups, the armed groups that were being funded, armed by the US, by NATO countries, by Qatar, by Saudi Arabia, by the Gulf Alliance states, by Israel. Russia came in, helped Syria defeat them in 2016. That happened. They were defeated. Incredible battles, right, in Aleppo. And Syria won. However, the U.S. never forgave Syria for that. Never forgave Syria for that. This war has been going on since 2011, mind you. So this is 11 years now. It's going to end up being, if all things continue the same, one of the U.S.'s longest wars. But of course, it's not really acknowledged the same. But the U.S. is building a new military base in Syria. So this war is intensifying. The U.S. is increasing its resources, its personnel in Syria, and now it's building a new military base. Now, later last month, we learned that, and we saw footage, video footage, and I'm going to read the report here, that the U.S. is stealing, outright stealing the military, Syria's oil, 80% of it each day. So this comes within a context of economic warfare. The U.S. is stealing Syria's oil. They have Caesar sanctions on Syria, starving Syria, destroying its currency, impoverishing the country, all the while escalating militarily. It's an occupation. 30% of the country is occupied by the United States, and they're literally stealing that oil and bringing it to Iraq and then funneling that oil to the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces, the so-called Rojava anarchists that are literally stealing Syria's oil, funneling it to their, of course, whatever is left of their armed groups that are fewer and far between these days, and also fueling the military installations that they're building, because you all know that energy is a huge part of the U.S. military. It's the biggest polluter. It's one of the hugest users of crude and energy, and it's a huge polluter. And it's a big monster that needs a lot to eat. And the U.S. can't send its own fracked gas and oil and all of that to fuel the military equipment and the buildings and all the things that are going up, all of the things that are happening in Syria. So they're stealing it from Syria to do that. So according to the UK-based Syrian, this is from the Cradle. This was reported on September 4th. Says, according to the UK-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is a very shady group, mind you. So this is a shady group, a group that's backed by the West. U.S. forces, it's actually, I think it's the organization that's like a front for the white helmets, I believe. U.S. forces established a third military base in Syria on September 3rd. The new U.S. military base was set up in Nakara village, just 3 kilometers from Kamishli in the northeastern province of Hasaka. The U.S. has 2 more bases, one of them located in Himo village and another one in Tel Faras near the Kamalishi airport. Armed groups have recently stepped up against U.S. occupation forces and their regional allies due to their illegal exploitation of fossil fuels. The Syrian government has accused the United States of stealing the country's natural resources, a staggering $107 billion since the war began in 2011. $107 billion stolen. On August 29th, U.S. forces reportedly looted a new batch of oil. An estimated 123 fuel tankers were seen to have left the resource-rich Jazeera region. Washington has intensified. Did I lose it? Sorry, I clicked on the link. Sorry about that. Washington has intensified its looting operation in Syria in the wake of its own severe energy crisis, which was exacerbated by sanctions imposed on Russia's energy sector. Earlier this month, the Syrian Oil Ministry released a statement saying that the U.S. Army plunders 66,000 barrels of oil every single day, amounting to around 83% of Syria's oil production. This is plunder. This is pillage. This is imperialism. This is neocolonialism. This is an attempt. And Syria's government is sovereign. Syria's government is not a neocolonial government. But what can Syria do in this situation? Syria can't wage an offensive, even though there has been fighting. And I'll show you just what has been happening there, because CENTCOM, the U.S.'s occupation force, its so-called military installation, it's a military regional installation for the Middle East, CENTCOM, the Central Command, they've been engaged in war with armed groups, so supposedly linked to Iran. But there's been resistance to this, obviously. Why wouldn't there be resistance to this? But Syria is in a very tough situation. The sanctions are crippling, and militarily, it is limited by the fact that any confrontation with the United States directly is a very dangerous provocation, which could lead to even a worse situation, right? This is kind of what the United States does, is it uses its military dominance to attempt to bait countries into really binding situations that you wouldn't wish for anybody. And so the suffering of the people continues, and the government, while it's doing all it can economically for people, can only do so much because the sanctions are so crippling. And this amount of energy being plundered per day, how do you operate an economy? How do you operate an economy, which was once a pretty bustling one? It was one of the most stable in the Middle East for a long time before 2011. And now it's the opposite, right? Syria is suffering an energy crisis at home that cripples the country and causes nationwide blackouts on a regular basis. Fossil fuels like oil and gas are not enough, however. The U.S. is also responsible for the theft of the country's wheat, while close to 70% of Syrians suffer from food insecurity. Yes, Syria's wheat. So it's not just when you see those oil tankers, if you saw the video, there is video of all these tankers, right? All these military vehicles taking Syria's oil, right? But it wasn't just oil. It was also Syria's wheat. Syria really relies on its own production. And now that imports of agriculture, now that imports have been stymied, right, have been ground to a halt because of Caesar sanctions, now the U.S. is stealing wheat. This has been going on since 2016-17, arguably began in 2015 under Obama, when the Obama administration first sent troops to occupy Syria, to occupy the 30% that is its most resource-rich area. And now Syrians are hungry. There's hunger in Syria. That wasn't really the case before the war, but now Syria is dealing with widespread hunger because the U.S. is literally stealing from them. It can't get any more simple. Renewed explosions on September 3rd were reported inside the military base at the occupied Al Amarf oil field. Despite eyewitness reporting the arrival of ambulances, the occupation army now claims the explosions were a result of military drills by coalition forces. So that's the report. A new military base is going up in Syria. The war is not just continuing, but it's escalating. And not many people are talking about it. Syria doesn't get the attention anymore, maybe, that it deserves, because a lot of the attention has been faced solely on Russia's military operation on Ukraine. In Ukraine, Sergei Lavrov recently, the foreign minister of Russia, recently said, I'm just paraphrasing him, he said something to the effect of, if Western minds want to be soothed about what's happening in Ukraine, maybe they should picture Russia as the United States and Ukraine or as Palestine or Yemen or Syria or Africa, right? He was saying that, well, it seems like a lot of these folks who are mad about what Russia is doing in Ukraine, this special military operation, maybe they'd feel better if they would just think about the numerous conflicts that these same forces, these neoliberals, neocons, these elites, these reactionaries, these anti-Russia, new Cold War reactionaries, if they would just think of this operation as akin to the U.S., what it does in the Middle East, what it does in Africa, what the West does in Africa and the Middle East, then people will be fine with it because they don't talk about it, right? There's no Syria flag for on Twitter going around, despite the fact that the United States not only has invaded Syria and occupied it, but is now stealing and has been stealing for many years now, stealing Syria's oil, stealing Syria's wheat. And then, of course, leveling, crippling sanctions. So people are starving, people are suffering, people are migrating. That's been the case for nearly 10 years now, right? A massive wave of migration because the war displaced so many people. And then, of course, the economic situation also displaces many people. Turkey and Europe acting as conduits, kind of safety nets that are not so safe, right? A lot of people dying at sea, trying to get away, being funneled into these migration patterns, right? Glenn Ford called it the biggest wave of people being displaced since the transatlantic slave trade, maybe even bigger in terms of the numbers, sheer numbers, and many of them being Syrian, not just Syrians, though, also people from Libya, Somalia, all across the destabilized Arab, Muslim, African world, Western Asia. There's been such a massive level of destabilization, you never hear about it. You'll hear a lot about Ukraine. Supposedly, Ukraine is suffering to a degree that's the worst since World War II. But yet, since World War II, the United States has been waging wars like the one in Syria that has cost trillions of dollars and millions of lives. Iraq, Syria, Libya, just being a few. And so the hypocrisy is palpable. And you'll never hear the Western media. You won't hear the U.S. political class talk about Syria unless they're talking about things like this. We're building a new military base. This new military base comes, and I just want to show you something that happened recently as well. So not 2 weeks before this military base was announced, and this is from the Cradle again. This is Pepe Escobar writes for them. They do a lot of good reporting. U.S. strikes hit IRGC linked groups in Syria, says CENTCOM. So CENTCOM was literally conducting airstrikes in Syria. Now, Israel conducts airstrikes in Syria like every other day. But CENTCOM literally announcing that it was conducting airstrikes is a pretty big deal. It shows that Joe Biden is now bombing Syria, just like he's reinitiating troops to Somalia. He is, and should the Democrats, or no matter what happens in the midterms, after the midterms, we're likely to see Joe Biden trying to pad his war resume. But Obama did the same thing. Trump does the same thing. All these presidents do the same thing. They're going to try to pad their war resumes leading into an election. So Syria was a big part of that. Remember, that happened right before the midterms. Libya was a big part of that. Happened right before the midterms. So it's going to happen again. And this is all in a lead up to it. And Syria might be a place where they try to pounce on the advantages that they've gained from sanctions. But on August 24th, the U.S. military announced that it had carried out a strike on Deir ez-Zor, targeting infrastructure facilities used by groups allegedly affiliated with Iran's IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. They said in a statement, said CENTCOM, such strikes are aimed at protecting U.S. forces from attacks by Iran-backed groups. This is what they always say. The statement said the U.S. strikes came in response to a recent drone attack on a compound run by the coalition and U.S.-backed Syrian opposition group, MAT, on August 15th. According to the UK-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, the airstrikes targeted the Ayash camps run by the Fatamayun group made up of fighters from Afghanistan. Al-Taif is a U.S. military base within territory controlled by the MAT and Homs Governorate, and is located 24 kilometers west of Al-Taif border crossing the Syrian desert. According to U.S. military spokesperson Colonel Joe Buccino, who did not identify any targets, the attacks are authorized by Joe Biden. CENTCOM described the strike as a proportionate and deliberate measure aimed at reducing the risk. They always say this, risk of escalation and minimizing casualties. So the point is, though, is that the U.S. is conducting airstrikes. We don't know if any civilians were killed. We don't know. It wasn't reported on. And we do know that people did die, though. They say it's all militants. And I always say this. When the U.S. is killing militants, you have to be concerned because oftentimes the U.S. is not targeting. We saw this in Deir ez-Zor, we saw this during the height of the war on Syria, 2016, even 17, when the coalition forces went in, occupied Syria and began so-called fighting terrorism, they'd actually give cover to the actual terrorists like ISIS. They would bomb Syrian forces, or they would attempt to bomb Syrian forces, and then allow ISIS and those terrorists to then gain leverage in that way, allow them to wage their offensive. So almost giving air cover to the armed groups. That's what the U.S. is all about. That's what they did in Libya. And that's what they were doing in Syria. That's what they've always been doing. So when you say that CENTCOM killed, or not quotes under kill, but when they killed militants backed by Iran, you have to be concerned that they're actually targeting the resistance, which is Syria. Yes, Iran is helping Syria. Russia had helped Syria incredibly and still does in many capacities. That's what they're targeting. They're trying to weaken Syria even further. And it's not about protecting civilian casualties or minimizing conflict and risk. No. Any kind of airstrikes the U.S. is conducting in Syria is all about the number one goal, which is to weaken the Syrian government and hopefully see it collapse at some point. At this point, the goal has not been reached. And it's likely that goal won't be reached. But they're going to make Syria scream regardless. So the new military base, these airstrikes, they all serve the same purpose: supporting the sanctions, supporting the suffering, starving the Syrian people, and trying to enact regime change. So that's what's happening with Syria. It's a very concerning situation. We need to have solidarity and assert the right to self-determination for the Syrian people. They've chosen Bashar al-Assad, the Ba'ath Party in Syria, as their rightful government. It's got to be respected. It's yet to be respected, but we can't expect it to be respected unless we launch our own kind of offensive, which is anti-war, anti-imperialist offensive right here in the United States and across the West. That's what we need to be doing. And so this information should only pour more fuel onto whatever fire can be lit under our bellies. All right, everyone. So keep liking the video, of course. Keep hitting that subscription button. Keep hitting that notifications bell. And of course, the best way to support this work is on Patreon at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. It's the best way to support this work. It goes a long way. Got updates coming up to the channel I'm very excited about, and I want to be able to compensate for that. I also want to getting some great help on that. I also want to be able, there's just some things I got to support. I've got to update technologically. So I'm really looking, through this fall to keep building up a support base. So patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong is the way to do it. Last story. So this isn't really news story. I'm just going to kind of go here, and it's very related to what I was just saying about Syria. And I'm going to save another story that I had for later because I think it's evergreen. All right. Tomorrow is 9/11. I thought I was going to stream tomorrow. I don't think I am. I don't think I'm going to stream tomorrow. But tomorrow is September 11th. September 11th is a big day for the United States because, well, we're constantly reminded that on September 11th, 2001, there were attacks and there were planes that fell on the Pentagon, on the Twin Towers. There was, there was the World Trade Center attacks, and then, of course, the others that happened surrounding it. Now, the war on terror is becoming an adult. It's turning 21 tomorrow. And we are going to hear a lot about September 11th on, September 11th, 2001 on that day. It's going to be celebrated. It's going to be mourned. It's going to be talked about as this tragic day for the United States. And for the people that died, it was tragic. A lot of people died. A lot of working class people died, but a lot of people died just generally, especially in New York City. And my wife's uncle was lucky. He worked in that building, wasn't there when it happened, but a lot of people were affected, and people in the surrounding area, the illness, the sickness, it was awful. But what we won't hear from the Western media, from the US corporate media, is the real tragedy that came out of. It's not just a tragedy that people died on that day in 2001 in the United States, but the real tragedy is how the US responded to it. Because it's quite obvious that now in 2022, the US has deep alliances with the very forces who were complicit in the attack. We know that Saudi was. We know that possibly Israel was. We know that there was a lot of complicity in this attack. I'm not going to make direct links. That's for others to determine. There's a lot of, circumstantial evidence and all kinds of things. And, definitely not trying to have YouTube take this video down just because I said the wrong thing about 9/11. But the real important thing about 9/11, 2001, is that the United States, despite their own fingerprints being all over this attack happening, right? Its own fingerprints all over it. And this was even covered by people like Michael Moore, right? Just the negligence, the absolute seemingly like, oh, this is going to happen. Okay. It happened. And then the US went on a rampage. It's quite obvious from the response that 9/11 September was very convenient for the establishment, in that after 10 years of shock therapy, austerity, of unipolar domination, the US saw an opportunity to escalate its agenda for global domination, to extend the dominance of capital at home and abroad, and to create a more repressive political atmosphere through this event. And that's what they did. So mass surveillance. I know people whose families were targeted, who they were targeted because they're Arab, because they practice Islam. They were targeted by US intelligence. There was mass harassment followings all across this city, but all across the country. Then the Patriot Act, right? The Defense Authorization Acts, which now have military detention for suspicion of terrorism there. The whistleblowers that have been punished based on being called terrorists. The wars abroad that were waged. The wars abroad. Iraq and Afghanistan. Afghanistan was invaded very soon after, blamed for the attacks, blamed for them, despite the fact that everyone in those planes were identified as Saudi, or as they were, there was no, right, Max Blumenthal has covered this in his book, no reflection on the fact that the U.S. had been pumping weapons and logistical support to forces like the Mujahideen since 1979 to undermine the Soviet Union, and then to create favorable conditions across the Middle East by creating sectarian strife, by creating armed conflict, right? The U.S. had been supporting these groups. The U.S. created, right, out of these groups, then created fertile conditions for them by invading Afghanistan, and only Barbara Lee voted against it. Everyone voted for it. Everybody voted for the invasion of Afghanistan because it was the right war, right? It was the right war because Afghanistan was to blame. And only in 2021 was that, quote unquote, ended. And we see now the people of Afghanistan being starved, literally starved by the United States. Babies dying because the United States wants to continue to wage war as this war on terror. Now the Taliban, right, is the force that needs to be overthrown. And that was what we were told, that the Taliban was to blame. The Taliban had committed these attacks, right? Osama bin Laden was the one who committed these attacks. And despite the fact that he wasn't connected to Afghanistan other than maybe seeking refuge there once in a while. So these wars, right? And then Iraq, nothing to do with anything that had to do with September 11th. But Iraq was invaded in 2003. And then, of course, you have General Wesley Clark, the former NATO secretary, saying, well, after the war on terror, I heard Donald Rumsfeld. What did he tell me? He told me that we're going to invade 7 countries. That's what we're going to do. 7 countries in as many years. And that included Iran, that included Libya, that included Somalia. I believe Lebanon might have been on that list. Syria was definitely on this, and Iraq and Afghanistan. I believe those were the 7. And so the U.S. military apparatus expanded trillions of dollars, right? Millions of deaths, 1 million in Iraq alone, 50 to 100,000 Afghanistan, Pakistan, altogether, probably more than 100,000 people dead, killed. This isn't to mention the proxy wars, the instability in Somalia, now Yemen. We see what's happening with Saudi Arabia and Yemen, but the United States helped fuel that situation. So the war on terror has been a disaster for the region. It's been a disaster for the world. And it's been a disaster for working class people in the United States who have seen just incredible amounts of resources get funneled to surveillance, private contracting, the militarization of the police, of everything, so to speak. Everything was militarized. Everything you can think of has been militarized since 9/11. So you won't hear any of that tomorrow. Well, today's September 10th. You won't hear any of that on September 11th, 2022. You won't have any calls to end these destructive wars, including the proxy wars on Afghanistan still, Syria. You won't hear any of that. But the legacy of the war on terror remains. It remains in the project of endless war. The war on terror was really the declaration of endless war. It was endless war on all people who dare to resist empire. And this included anyone in the United States and the West that dared to even think that they would resist empire. Because some people say, oh, my privacy, I don't need it anyway. I know so many people who have said that to me. I have nothing to hide. Well, if the NSA is spying on you, if the NSA is taking your data, if all the intelligence agencies are conducting a war on terror on you because they believe anybody could be a suspected terrorist, then that means your political activity, should you decide, well, I don't like injustice, I don't like war, I don't want to see people die, I want to see people have what they need, their basic human rights met, then you could be a terrorist. You could be militarily detained indefinitely. You could end up like Julian Assange. This is the legacy of the war on terror. It's not about whether you have anything to hide or not. It's about this war on everybody, right? Creating a overall political atmosphere and a policy that says, well, we're already preparing the way. We're universalizing a policy that had existed exclusively for revolutionaries, exclusively for people who were fighting the system, who were saying we want a better system. Now that's been universalized, right? So what happened to the Black Panthers? What happened to the early labor movement? What happened to the American Indian movement? Those policies were expanded under the war on terror. So it was a war on everyone except for the elite. And then, of course, the wars abroad were against all countries who dare to resist. So Somalia, you remember Somalia, the Islamic Courts Union, and they were punished for it mightily. Syria, sovereign government. Iraq under Saddam, that was a sovereign government. That was on the Ba'ath Party in Iraq. It was a sovereign government. Had to go. Afghanistan wasn't necessarily a sovereign government, but still sitting on top of trillions in mineral resources, and at one time had been sovereign, at one time had a socialist government. Well, let's keep that going. Let's make sure that doesn't happen again. And of course, let's make sure that Afghanistan, it's really is a route between the East and the West. Let's make sure we have control of that. Iran, sovereign government, right? Like there's a pattern here, right? Libya was a sovereign government, was a government that stood up for liberation movements, the most prosperous country in Africa, right? It gave aid to South Africa, it gave aid to the Irish, it gave aid to African liberation movements. Libya was a government that had to go as well. And the war on terror declared a war on Libya that would eventually transpire in 2011. So that's the legacy of the war on terror. That's what it is. And it's American exceptionalism on steroids. It's all about creating this other, right? That these terrorists over there, that largely the legitimate ones, largely created by U.S. policy and Western policy, but that those terrorists justify anything and everything, right? It's not about, look what China did. It's not about, Maybe we should help Iraq and Syria, all these countries. Maybe we should help them elevate their levels of standards of living and their education, right? Maybe we should support what they already had so this wouldn't happen. Libya was literally like, hey, we'll work with you on eliminating terrorism as long as it's like actually terrorists. Gaddafi was working with the West saying, yeah, we'll get rid of these armed groups. They're a real thorn, right? They were real. Al-Qaeda was a real thing. But of course, the contradictory policy was that the U.S. was covertly backing it and had been since 1979. So it was always about destabilization, and the war on terror continues to do that. And so I talked about Syria, but I'll just talk. I just want to show you another instance, and so I can weave this story in here in the last 5 to 10 minutes. So the war on terror is often seen as this epical moment, right? It's a moment in history. It's a shift in U.S. foreign policy. And a lot of people say, well, the war on terror is 2001 to 2017-18. And then guess what was announced? Great power competition. China and Russia are now the biggest national security threats. So now we're in a different epical moment. I want you to understand the war on terror not as some kind of moment, but as part of a development process, as part of the imperialist development process. That's what socialists should do. They should understand imperialism not as a policy, not as a moment in time, not as something the government does, but as an overall development process of a system. Imperialism is a system. Finance capital is the dominant mode in that system. Endless war is what finance capital is reliant upon. Monopolies, they're reliant upon this endless war. That's why they created a whole industry now that has been in the works since arguably World War I. This military industrial complex that has developed since that time is the arm of the burgeoning imperialist finance capitalist class. It's no wonder that Lenin wrote Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, during the lead up to the Russian Revolution, because World War I actually did create this ascendant finance capitalist class and thrust them into power, thrusted them into the vanguard of the capitalist class. And so that has continued and it has reached such a moment, such an epical, these huge proportions, right? That now, of course, the system is doing this. It was doing that 100 years ago, but now it's hit a low point. But I want you to think about this not as a policy, but as something that leads into the next. Because what the war on terror did, it was a war on all resistance to empire. And so after it had become outstretched, it had gained and lost in various areas, right? Whether we talk about Syria, Libya, Iraq, all those had a lot of externalities, a lot of issues. They came about, some gains in the sense that you did get rid of some governments, you did weaken some governments, but you also had for U.S. imperialism kind of like this instability that was mounting, these contradictions that were mounting. And so the shift to Russia and China is not so much about, okay, well, the war on terror is done, now we're moving on. It's, well, the war on terror was always supposed to lead up to this moment. It was always going to lead up to Russia and China because Russia and China happen to be governments that have developed. Russia has developed recently, and China since 1949 have been governments that the United States has always seen as antithetical to its imperialist domination. And so recently, you hear, right, every day almost, most days, especially in the business sections, finance sections of the corporate media, but even among the U.S. political class, the Western political class, China's stealing, China's hacking. They never show you evidence. They never tell you exact instances. They don't say this is the case. They just say, we know that China's hacking us, right? We know that China's hacking us, stealing our stuff, stealing our patents, stealing our information, blah, 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 blah. This despite all that I said about the war on terror. But let me show you what China just found out. And this is part of the legacy, because now this war on terror apparatus is being deployed against Russia and China in what are proxy wars and regime change wars. And these wars are part of a new Cold War. But this new Cold War is using this war on terror apparatus. And here you go. The U.S. hacked China 10,000 times and stole 140 gigabytes of critical data, says a report. September 5th, 2002, this was reported as a CGTN. The NSA, the U.S. National Security Agency, conducted over 10,000 cyber attacks against China in recent years and is suspected to have stolen 140 gigabytes of valuable data, according to a joint investigation report released on Monday by China's National Computer Virus Emergency Response Center and the internet security company Qihu 360 Technology Company Ltd. The investigation was launched after Northwestern Polytechnical University, a leading Chinese university in aviation, reported being attacked in April. The investigators have traced the cyber attacks back to the Office of Tailored Access Operations of the NSA. The NPU is targeted because many top-tier talents in the country work there. Jin Qi, deputy head of the local police bureau, told China Media Group many national-level research projects were conducted there. A total of 13 people were found to have directly launched the cyber attacks, with more than 60 contracts signed to cover the malicious activities. They first scout the network, says Bian Lang, a network security expert at Qihu 360. Then they create a customized tool to target the specific network. The hackers used 41 tools to breach the firewalls, plant remote-controlled backdoors, steal critical data, and erase any traces of doing so. There are 4 steps in their attack, said Du Jianhua, senior engineer at CVRERC. Break in, establish long-term control, keep stealing data, and after everything's done, clear the scene. They also tried to hide their real location identity using so-called jump servers. A total of 54 jump servers were traced by the investigators, which are spread in 17 countries like Japan, South Korea, Sweden, Poland, and Ukraine. So 10,000 times, 200 plus gigs of critical data, economic data. I mean, this was found out also between the years, I believe. What was it? Qihu 360 also found out, WikiLeaks had reported that there have been also widespread hacks by the CIA. So the CIA, right, hacking China, NSA hacking China. This is a byproduct of the war on terror. The NSA is not just doing this to our data, it's doing this to everybody. It was spying on Angela Merkel. It was spying on U.S. so-called allies in Europe, and it's doing it to China in this new Cold War. So the war on terror's legacy also has to do with this new Cold War. We should see imperialist aggression as being interconnected. And we haven't heard anything from the Western media about what happened to China. This is a major scandal. This is evidence. This is proof. This is proof that the NSA, through a very specific division, was stealing data from China, going after a polytechnic university, which breeds a lot of critical talent. And obviously, right, we know that there's economic warfare happening on China. There's attempts to try to isolate China economically, create the so-called CHIPS alliance against China of countries in Asia plus Taiwan, the Chip 4 alliance or whatever it's supposed to be called, that's already failing. Sanctions on Huawei, sanctions on China's solar industry because of human rights, quote unquote, in Xinjiang. I mean, it's on and on and on. The attempts to undermine China economically also have to do with covert warfare. And covert warfare is one of the huge legacies of the war on terror, because the U.S. had always done this. There's always been a deep state. There's always been a spy state, a real state. That's always been the case. But the war on terror massively intensified it. And one of the big frustrations for the United States is that it can't get into China. You've seen, right, the CIA, they've reoriented toward China and said, we need to make China a priority. And this comes after there were so-called rumors that CIA agents were dying and getting apprehended in China. There's a lot of anger that China, inside of China, it's really difficult to penetrate. It's really difficult to conduct intelligence there because, well, it's a sovereign country that takes these things very seriously, and it has the developmental capacity economically, and it has a strong political legitimacy to prevent it. So there's a lot of frustration about that. And even after the CIA announced that, they said, well, we're just going to make mission centers. So just mission centers, but they're not in China. They'll be somewhere around the area. and we're going to focus on how to spy on China better. But in the world of cyber and technology, as we all know, that's one area where the United States can focus and intensify its warfare on China in attempt to do the exact thing that it accuses China of doing. Steal their economic plans, steal their information in an attempt to sabotage China, in an attempt to try to outcompete China in the most heinous and blunderous and criminal of ways, right? This is just criminality. This is just gangsterism. And so that's what the war on terror is. And that's what this specific incident is all about. And I just wanted to show you this because I had it as a story that I wanted to talk about. But I'm glad I was able to weave it in because it does show that the war on terror's legacy informs and is directly related to what we're seeing now with this new Cold War on China, on Russia too. This apparatus is being used against Russia and China now, and globally, it is the apparatus which the U.S. will continue to pursue its domination, its imperialist domination, no matter what the form or no matter what the message, the narrative is, it's going to continue to pursue this. So that's the legacy of the war on terror, everyone. We need to be working on how to build a new legacy, which is a war of resistance against this. We need to turn imperialist war into civil war, as Lenin said, and we need to make that a socialist, socialist in character. We need to make we need to create a mass movement that is moving in that direction, not in all these other directions. I don't know what. Everyone's directionless at this point, right? Bernie didn't work out, so they don't know what to do. But we've got to really be disciplined about something like socialism, something like anti-imperialism, and come to the masses with a firm message that both affirms where a lot of people already are at, and helps move people, right? Move people in a correct direction, because that's what revolutionaries do. We move people in the correct direction. We just don't say, well, you have certain right ideas and certain incorrect ideas, so we're just going to let all those incorrect ideas go, and just, even if they influence policy, even if they influence your behavior, even if they create reactionary situations that we can't really reconcile, divisions in the working class, we're just going to go along with it. No. We say we build unity where there is unity, and we criticize, self-criticize, and hopefully build more unity in that process. That's what Marxists do and communists do. We criticize, we self-criticize, and then we build more unity, right? We engage with people as serious potential revolutionaries. Serious potential revolutionaries. That's what we do. We have trust and faith and hope and love for people to be able to move in the correct direction, whatever that may be. I have my own opinion on that based on study, based on experience. I think the socialist direction is the one. If we have to debate out other directions that people think are correct, then we should do that. But all in the name of moving the masses in the correct direction, in the direction that will lead us to a victorious class struggle, not a stagnant, not a losing class struggle for us. So anyway, so I'm about 90 minutes now. All right. That was all the stories I have for today. Please do like the video. All right, I'll stay on for another couple minutes. I'll say thanks. I'm going to say thanks to a few super chats, but like the video. All right, hit that notifications bell. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed. Of course, hit that notifications bell so you're notified. Keep sharing this around. Leave a comment when you're done here. That helps also boost the algorithm. And also go back to prior clips. See, I got prior clips on this channel. I post at least once per day. Like those, because that also helps boost their algorithm, which helps get the channel out. So I'm just going to say hello to, I'm going to say thank you to Felix for the super chat. Thank you so much. There was a few others. So let me see. They just disappear. I hate that. Here on the stream yard. Let's see who else is out here. I definitely saw more than. Did I pass it? Oh, here we go. Thank you, Intermediary Fossil, for the super chat, and thanks again, Felix, for the double super chat. Thank you. You're welcome. Syria is very important to me. So, for those who may not know, Syria, I mean, Libya was really what I think thrust me into anti-imperialism, really pushed me in that direction. I was very anti-war. You know, Bush's wars were really easy to oppose. I was young. I didn't know any better. I hadn't studied imperialism before Libya. But when Libya happened, I started really doing my research. That really got me into the world situation more so than I had been at that point. I had been mostly in labor, hanging around Occupy, trying to understand the U.S. situation better. But then Libya was happening, and I was like, wow, Obama, Libya, African country, this is not sitting right. And then the research confirmed my suspicions. And then Syria happened basically at the same time. And so once Libya was over and done with, meaning destroyed, the U.S. moved on to Syria and actually moved a lot of those fighters into Syria. And I remember that. And I remember, just being very curious and just being like, why is this happening? Because I had known very little about Afghanistan and Iraq before that either. But Syria was sitting there as like this next target on the list. And then I started learning about Wesley Clark's revelation, right? When he revealed publicly what he had learned in private from Donald Rumsfeld in the Bush administration, targeting these countries. And I was like, why? What is it about Syria? And then learning about Syria's political system was very interesting. And then I had the privilege in Boston, where I grew up and went back home for a little while, of working with Syrians, a part of the Syrian American Forum, which did really great work resisting the war, being really a leading part in the East Coast, at least where I was in Boston, leading anti-war demonstrations. And these were mainly middle class, mainly professionals, but extremely sympathetic, right? They were they had a very keen sense of nationalism and support for their government. And they would come to demonstrations with the Assad pictures and the Syrian flags, which is controversial at this time, 2012, 13. Very dangerous times for people to be carrying that around. There's a lot of anti-Assad, anti-Syria hysteria happening. And so, through my research, I was able to find out and understand better the political process, the economic process, not without its contradictions, but one that was far more favorable than the one that the U.S. was meting out. So that was a huge moment for me. So Syria is definitely important. And it's part of this war on terror. I mean, I was a young kid. I was in 2001. What grade was I in? I think I was in 5th grade. Let's see. Yeah, I was in 5th grade, 4th grade. I think I was in 4th grade. I was in 4th grade when 9/11 happened. I didn't understand what was going on, but I'll never forget my dad looking at the television when we were rushed out of school. There was everyone was very alarmed. There was a lot of panic, rushed out of school. Luckily, I lived like 3 blocks from school, so I just walked home, got back home, and my dad was watching the TV, and the buildings were, being shown, smoking. And I just remember just the fear and the devastation emotionally that everyone was feeling around me, and me being like, what's happening? I don't know. But of course, in subsequent years, the consequences were palpable in terms of the policing, the militarization. And then, of course, I was much older when the Boston bombing happened, and I saw for real how the war on terror affected things. I was taking a jog during martial law. I remember being literally scared. I like was luckily where I was in that part of Boston. I was running kind of away from the heavily armed militarized police. But I remember being scared as hell, being like, why is everyone not outside now? Like, this is weird. It was kind of a busy area by the Charles. I was like, this is suspicious. Then I see these huge Stingray laden military vehicles with police that look like they were invading. They were in an occupation force. I was like, oh, all right, I gotta go the other way. But I see, you see pretty clearly how this war on terror, in that most extreme sense, was working. So yeah. But anyway, guys, that's all the content I have today. I really appreciate you coming out tonight. I thought I was gonna come on tomorrow early. I was like, oh, maybe if I can rush on a guest. I don't think that's going to happen. But I will clip this up. I'll probably clip the War on Terror segment for September 11th. And I definitely want you to support this channel by liking the video, hitting the subscription button, notifications bell. But do consider a Patreon subscription for a minimal monthly amount. $5 less than that per month. You get to ask questions that I answer on stream. I don't think I have a new question today, but you get to ask questions. I answer them on stream. And then you also get early first access, first notifications of everything that I do. You can also subscribe on Substack, which I also really appreciate. It's a one-time annual subscription, but it does cover kind of the month-long, the months it accumulates, and it really helps. And people tend to like Substack, tend to like it better as a source for supporting people. So you can do that as well. That's the best way to support me in this work. But with that said, everyone, I think I'm going to head out, and I'll be back soon. Probably, I'll probably be taking the next few days off. And then maybe I'll be on Call-In tomorrow. That's a big possibility. So definitely follow me on the Call-In app, Callin, the Call-In app. Also, my Telegram. I don't know what it is about Telegram, but I have a link tree. So I don't even have to really do this if you just go to my link tree in the description of this video. But I do want to just share my Telegram again, because that's where I share a lot of notifications as well for everybody publicly. No paywalls here, really, for me. But subscribe, because I've been losing a lot of people on Telegram. A lot of people get banned from Telegram, or they delete their accounts, or their account gets deleted because they're not active. So like Telegram, if you're not active for a certain number of days or months or something, they delete you. But I just put the Telegram link so you can subscribe there, and I will notify people there, as well as Twitter and other places, about a potential call-in tomorrow if I have time. All right, everyone. Salute. Be well. And I'll be back with you all probably some evening early next week. All right. Take care. Peace out. And I'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.